Hey everybody, I'm going to do a read aloud today. This book I got out of a library, out of a high school library. It's about George Washington Carver, Black Americans of Achievement. And I'm going to start with, it says he's a scientist and educator. I'm going to start with chapter 2. Chapter 1 is kind of just like an overview. So chapter 2 is called Obscure Beginnings. I'm going to read this aloud. Carver's early childhood is shrouded in legend. His mentor, Booker T. Washington, said in his book, My Larger Education, that Carver was born on the plantation of Mr. Carver and was allowed to grow up among the servants' quarters, getting his living as best he could. Carver himself contributed to the story by calling himself a poor, defenseless orphan. This certainly exaggerated the story, but the truth itself was more than enough. George Washington Carver was born into slavery on a farm near the village of Diamond, Missouri, during the waning months of the Civil War. His mother, Mary, belonged to Moses Carver, a frontiersman and homesteader who had settled in the southwestern corner of the state about 25 years earlier with his wife, Susan. Independent, proud, and thriving on their 240 acres, the Carvers were to be the only real parents George would ever know. Moses Carver opposed slavery in principle, but his children had grown up and left home, and hiring labor for his Newton County farm proved difficult. In 1855, he bought Mary from one of his neighbors for $700. She was then just 13 years old. Records of the time are sketchy, but it is thought that during the next decade, she bore at least 4 children, including twin girls who apparently died as infants. 2 sons arrived, Jim born in 1859, and George born, as he would recall, near the end of the war, in 1864 or 1865. It is likely that his actual birth date was during the spring of 1865. The identity of George's father is not known, but he was probably a slave on a nearby farm, a man who died around the time George was born. I am told the scientist wrote in 1822 that my father was killed while hauling wood with an ox team. In some way, he fell from the load under the wagon, both wheels passing over him. George never got to know his mother either. They were separated shortly after his birth. Their parting was a traumatic event that reflected the horrific, turbulent times in which it occurred. This part is called War Comes to the United States. Missouri, a slave state that remained part of the Union during the Civil War, was a place of extraordinary tension, both before and after the outbreak of that war in 1861. Governor Claiborne Fox Jackson was a pro-slavery man who favored secession, and a majority of the Missouri legislature agreed with his views. With the arrival of new settlers, however, considerable Union sentiment had entered the state during the preceding 3 decades, and secession from the Union was rejected by a state convention that was elected to consider the issue. Jackson's subsequent attempts to claim Missouri for the Confederacy were thwarted by Union forces, and he and several members of the legislature were forced to flee the capital of Jefferson City. They eventually end up in Neosho, only 8 miles from Diamond and the Carver farm. After enacting an order of succession there, they were driven out of the state entirely and remained in exile through the war. As such events suggest, the Missouri populace was deeply divided in its loyalties during the Civil War. In the border regions, especially, guerrilla warfare erupted with a vengeance, pitting Confederate sympathizing bushwhackers, including William Cantrill and the soon-to-be famous outlaws Frank and Jesse James, against Unionist Jayhawkers. There's a small part in here about the Civil War. There's a quick picture in here. It shows some of the damage that was done by the Civil War. Underneath, I'll read the caption. It says, after the Civil War, much of the South's infrastructure was left in shambles. The colorized photograph above shows the ruins of Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The fort, a Union stronghold, was bombarded by the Confederate Army in 1861, officially beginning the war. Ambush, theft, murder, and swift and bloody raids on farms and settlements were forms that the fighting took. Union sympathizers like Moses Carver, who were prime targets for the roving rebel bands and bushwhackers, raided his farm at least 3 times between 1863 and 1865. On one occasion in the fall or early winter of 1863, they hanged the farmer from a tree by his thumbs. burning his bare feet with hot coals and demanding to know where he had hidden his money. Despite the torture, he refused to tell them, and they left. They were more successful on a later raid, causing him thereafter to bury his money in various places around the farm. Near the end of the war, bushwhackers came again, running from the sound of their horses. Moses Carver managed to rush the 5-year-old Jim to safety, but Mary and the infant George were not so lucky. The raiders rode away with the mother and her baby and carried them into Arkansas, a Confederate state that lay 20 miles to the south. A kindly man who had come to love Mary and her sons as more than just property, Moses Carver was determined to reclaim the abducted mother and child. To do so, he approached a neighbor named John Bentley, a Union scout who was knowledgeable about the guerrilla bands and their movements. Bentley agreed to go in search of the kidnapped parent. Within a few days, he returned with George, nearly dead from whooping cough. He had been unable to find Mary, however, and what became of her was never discovered. For returning the baby, Moses rewarded Bentley with one of the prized possessions of the Carver family, a racehorse. Meanwhile, the long and bloody Civil War was drawing to a close. General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Confederate forces, surrendered to his Union counterpart, General Ulysses S. Grant, at Appomattox, Virginia, on April 9, 1865. During the next month and a half, the Confederate armies accepted one by one to their defeat. The momentous task of putting a traumatized nation back together lay ahead. The end of the war introduced a new reality to American life: emancipation of the slaves. In Missouri, they were freed under the provisions of a new state constitution. As orphans of the war, Mary's 2 surviving sons were fortunate that the Carvers were inherently decent people. Having no children themselves, the white couple raised George and Jim as their own. So this next part is called Childhood with the Carvers. Clearly, the loss of his natural parents and the circumstances of his early childhood affected George Washington Carver deeply. As he told one of his biographers later in his life, "There are so many things that naturally I erase from my mind. There are some things that an orphan child does not want to remember. Even so, his memories of his foster parents were fond ones. The Carvers," he recalled, "did their best to give him and his brother a good home." Nonetheless, Carver felt a strong desire to learn more about his origins. He tried to ask Susan to tell him anything she could about his mother, but she always started crying when she talked about Mary. He often ran his hands over his mother's old spinning wheel, thinking of her. That wheel and the bill of sale for Mary remained 2 of his most prized possessions until the day he died. Jim, the stronger and healthier of the 2 boys, grew up helping Moses with the harder tasks of the farm, caring for livestock, planting, and harvesting. George's recurring respiratory ailments, probably a result of the kidnapping, left him frail and sickly for most of his childhood, limiting his duties to helping Susan with tasks such as mending clothes, cooking, tending the family garden, and doing laundry. Growing up near woods and wildlife gave George an appreciation of nature at an earlier age. When he was not helping Susan Carver with the housework, he explored the woods and marveled at the rocks and the trees, the birds and the animals. As he recalled later in his life, "I wanted to know the name of every stone and flower and insect and bird and beast. I wanted to know where it got its color, where it got its life, but there was no one to tell me. I do not know how I learned to read and write, but I did in some way, thanks to the Carvers. My only book was an old Webster's elementary spelling book. I knew it almost by heart. I sought the answers to all my questions from the spelling book, but all in vain." George indulged his fascination with nature by starting a collection of rocks, plants, insects, frogs, and reptiles. Susan Carver was not happy when George brought these discoveries into the house. After a time, she had him empty his pockets at the door whenever he returned from one of his visits to the woods. Before long, Susan and Moses Carver recognized that George's curiosity and eagerness to learn made him special. From his work with Susan in the garden, it became clear that he had a particular gift for nurturing plants. He even began a little garden of his own in the woods. There he transplanted and cultivated plants of various sorts, carefully observing the conditions that enabled them to grow and be healthy. He soon became known around Diamond as the plant doctor, and neighbors called in on him frequently to nurse their sickly flowers and plants back to health. Closely tied to George's love of nature was a deeply mystical religious sensibility. He came to see the wonders of nature, not to mention his own special talents, as evidence that God was everywhere. As an adult, he was always quick to credit the Creator for whatever he was able to accomplish in the laboratory. Exactly how much religious training George received in the Carver's home is not known. Moses Carver was reputedly a freethinker who distrusted organized religion and stayed home from church on Sundays. Nevertheless, George and Jim apparently attended the services at Diamond's non-denominational church, hearing sermons by a number of preachers of various Protestant faiths. By the time George was 10 or so, he had become a Christian. An integral part of his religious beliefs was a faith in divine visions. He claimed to have had his first such experience while still a child. Longing for a pocket knife, he saw an image of one in a dream. The next day, he ran to the spot in Moses Carver's field that he had appeared in his dream, and sure enough, the knife was there, protruding from a half-eaten watermelon. This served to further his belief in God and sense that he was meant to carry out God's mission. Being such a bright child, George yearned for more formal schooling than he was receiving at home. His foster parents, although barely educated themselves, tried to provide it for him. The color of his skin, however, made this difficult. Before the Civil War, it had been illegal in many states for blacks to learn how to read. The new Missouri State Constitution, adopted in 1865, mandated public education for blacks. Townships were required to furnish a school if the black population had more than 20 school-age children. For townships of less than that, the government had no laws against mixed schools. In practice, though, townships such as Diamond refused admission of blacks to the white schools. In 1876, the Carvers found a private tutor for George. It was not long before he was asking more questions than his teacher could answer. His spirit must have been brightened when in 1877, Moses and Susan decided he was old enough to attend the school for blacks at Neosho, the county seat. This last part of the chapter is called The Quest for Education. Though his enthusiasm for obtaining an education may have mingled with the pain of leaving the Carver farm for the first time since his abduction, 12-year-old George set out for Neosho, making the 8-mile trip on foot. He arrived in town too late to find lodging, so he chose to sleep in a barn. As it turned out, the barn belonged to a black couple, Andrew and Mariah Watkins. Like the Carvers, Andrew and Mariah Watkins did not have children. When they discovered the youngster, they were happy to give him a place to stay as long as he helped with the household chores. This lucky set of circumstances was made even better because the Watkins' home was near the school. In addition, Neosho was close enough to Diamond to allow George to visit the Carvers on weekends. Although obviously fond of George, Mariah Watkins was a firm believer in discipline and hard work, and she kept him busy. He even had to come home during recess to study and do laundry. She always encouraged him in his education, though telling him, "You must learn all you can, then go back to the world and give your learning back to the people." In addition, Mariah Watkins was a deeply religious woman who read regularly from the Bible. She introduced George to the African American Episcopal Church, which was quickly becoming the leading denomination of black Christians throughout the South. Mariah Watkins' influence no doubt did much to affirm George's faith. George's stay in the Watkins household lasted only about a year. The teacher at the Neosho school was a black man named Stephen Frost, and the range of his knowledge and preparation for teaching unfortunately fell far short of George's hopes and expectations. George found once again that he knew more than his teacher did. If he was to obtain the education he desired, he would have to look elsewhere. In the late 1870s, George Carver became a wanderer. He turned his sights to the nearby state of Kansas, which lay to the northwest, and was rapidly becoming a magnet for Southern blacks searching for education and a better life. A family traveling to the town of Fort Scott agreed to let him accompany them, and thus began a new phase in his life. So once again, this was chapter 2 of this book called George Washington Carver, Black Americans of Achievement. Says he was a scientist and educator. Chapter 2 was called Obscure Beginnings, and this was just a read aloud of that chapter. Hope you enjoyed. Thank you.